The stagecoach wheels kicked up dust as it rumbled to a stop at the crossroads. 11-year-old Sarah Carter clutched her small wooden box, the only possession she had left from her father, and peered anxiously through the window. The other passengers had already disembarked at proper towns along the route, but here there was nothing but rolling hills of prairie grass and a weathered signpost. "End of the line for you, girl," the driver called down, not unkindly. "Your uncle's ranch should be about 3 miles that way." He pointed vaguely eastward. Sarah swallowed hard. "But my uncle was supposed to meet me." The driver shrugged. "Can't wait any longer. Got a schedule to keep." He handed down her small carpet bag, everything she owned in the world packed inside. "Good luck to you, miss." As the stagecoach disappeared in a cloud of dust, Sarah stood alone at the crossroads, her thin cotton dress offering little protection against the Montana wind. September was giving way to October, and already the air carried a bite that promised a harsh winter ahead. "Well, Penny," she whispered to the small rag doll tucked in her pocket, the only toy she'd been allowed to keep after her father died. Uncle Frank must have forgotten. 3 months ago, her world had collapsed when influenza took her father. There had been no other family except a distant uncle, her father's half-brother who lived on a cattle ranch in Montana Territory. Letters had been exchanged, arrangements made. But now she stood alone, 3 miles from a place she'd never seen, belonging to a man she'd never met. Sarah squared her narrow shoulders. Her father hadn't raised her to give up easily. "We'd better start walking, Penny. 3 miles isn't so far." From the ridge overlooking the crossroads, Thomas Blackwood lowered his field glasses with a frown. He'd been tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on his calves when he spotted the stagecoach. Now he watched the small figure in a faded blue dress begin walking determinedly eastward in the direction of the old Carter place. At 38, Thomas was the owner of the largest ranch in the territory. The rocking bee, hard work, and smart investments had made him wealthy. But the war had left its scars, both visible and hidden. The jagged line across his left cheek was only the one people could see. The deeper wounds, the ones that had left him preferring the company of horses to people, those he kept buried. "What in God's name is Frank Carter thinking?" he muttered to his horse, a massive black stallion named Midnight. The neighboring rancher had a reputation for hard drinking and harder business dealings. Thomas had never much liked the man, but leaving a child to walk alone across open country was beyond irresponsible. It was dangerous. Thomas hesitated only briefly before turning Midnight toward the small figure trudging along the dusty road. Sarah heard the horse before she saw it. The steady drumming of hooves made her turn, her heart racing with hope that perhaps her uncle had come after all. But the rider who approached was a stranger, tall and broad-shouldered on a horse as black as coal. As he drew closer, she could see a scar running down his face, and for a moment her courage faltered. He reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon, miss. You seem to be a long way from anywhere." Sarah lifted her chin, trying to look braver than she felt. "I'm going to my uncle's ranch. It's only 3 miles that way." "Frank Carter's place?" the man asked, his expression unreadable. "Yes, sir. I'm Sarah Carter. My father died, and Uncle Frank is taking me in." Something flashed in the man's eyes. Anger, perhaps, though it didn't seem directed at her. "I'm Thomas Blackwood. I own the Rocking Bee, which neighbors your uncle's property." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming. 3 miles is a long walk with bad weather moving in." Sarah clutched her bag tighter. Her father had always warned her about strangers, but there was something about this man's steady gaze that made her think he could be trusted. As if reading her hesitation, Thomas dismounted and stood at a respectful distance. "I'd be happy to give you a ride to your uncle's place. Wouldn't be right to leave you out here alone with night coming on." Sarah studied him carefully. Despite the scar and his imposing size, his eyes were kind. "My doll Penny says you seem like a gentleman, Mr. Blackwood." A flicker of a smile crossed Thomas's weathered face. Well, if Penny vouches for me, I suppose that settles it. He extended his hand. May I help you up, Miss Carter? The rocking bee spread across the valley below them as Thomas guided Midnight along the ridge trail. It was a shortcut to the Carter property, and it offered Sarah her first view of the country that was to be her new home. Is that your ranch? She asked in awe, pointing to the sprawling collection of buildings nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains. Yes, Thomas replied. My father started it with just 20 acres and a dream. Now it's the biggest spread in the territory. It looks like a small town, Sarah marveled, taking in the main house, barns, bunkhouse, and corrals. Sometimes feels like one, Thomas admitted. Got about 30 hands working for me, plus Mrs. Abernathy, who keeps house, and Doc Wilson, who looks after the horses, and occasionally the cowboys when they need patching up. Do you have a family? Sarah asked innocently. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I did once. My wife Catherine died in childbirth 8 years ago. Our son with her. Sarah's small hand patted his arm. My mama died when I was 4. Papa said it gets easier, but you never stop missing them. Thomas glanced down at her, surprised by the simple wisdom. Your father sounds like he was a smart man. He was a teacher, Sarah said proudly. We lived in Chicago, but when he got sick, there wasn't enough money. Her voice trailed off. Thomas nodded, understanding the unspoken poverty after a breadwinner's death was an all-too-common story. They rode in companionable silence until the Carter ranch came into view. Compared to the rocking bee, Frank Carter's place was a sorry sight. The fences needed mending, the barn roof sagged dangerously, and the small cabin had windows patched with oilskin instead of glass. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. This was no place for a child. As they approached, a man staggered out of the cabin, bottle in hand. Frank Carter was in his 50s, with a face reddened by drink and weather. He squinted up at them, recognition slowly dawning. Blackwood, what you doing on my property? His bleary gaze shifted to Sarah. Who's the kid? Thomas felt Sarah stiffen behind him. This is your niece, Sarah. She arrived on today's stagecoach. You were supposed to meet her, Carter. Frank cursed. Was that today? Lost track of time. He waved dismissively. Well, bring her in then. She can start earning her keep right away. Plenty of work for small hands around here. Thomas helped Sarah down from the horse, feeling a growing unease. He'd known Frank Carter was a hard man, but the calculating look he gave his niece spoke of something worse. Thank you for the ride, Mr. Blackwood, Sarah said quietly, her eyes downcast. It was my pleasure, Miss Carter. Thomas hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in paper. Some jerky and biscuits. Mrs. Abernathy always packs too much. It was a lie. He'd been planning to eat it himself, but the girl looked half-starved. Sarah's eyes widened at the unexpected kindness. Thank you, sir. Come on, girl, Frank called impatiently. Daylight's wasting. With a last grateful look at Thomas, Sarah hurried toward the cabin. Thomas watched her go, a dark feeling settling in his chest. He'd done what he could, delivered her safely to her kin. But something told him this wouldn't be the last he'd see of Sarah Carter. Over the next few weeks, Thomas found himself making excuses to ride past the Carter place. Each time, he caught glimpses of Sarah working, hauling water, feeding chickens, hanging laundry. Work wasn't unusual for children on frontier ranches, but something about the scene troubled him. The girl was too thin, her movements sometimes careful, as if she were in pain. Mrs. Abernathy noticed his preoccupation one evening as he picked at his dinner. Something on your mind, Mr. Blackwood. You've barely touched your stew. Thomas trusted his housekeeper's judgment. Emma Abernathy had come west as a young bride, lost her husband to Apache raiders, and built a new life for herself with wisdom earned through hardship. She'd been with the rocking bee since before Catherine died, and was one of the few people Thomas felt comfortable confiding in. "It's the Carter girl," he admitted. "Something doesn't sit right." Mrs. Abernathy nodded sagely. "Folks in town are talking. Millie at the general store says the child came in with bruises on her arms last week. Frank claimed she fell from the hayloft, but she let the implication hang in the air." Thomas's hand tightened around his fork. "Carter's drinking worse than ever." "That poor child," Mrs. Abernathy murmured. "Losing her father, then being sent to that." She stopped herself from saying something unladylike. "What can be done?" "Nothing legally," Thomas said grimly. "He's her guardian. The law gives him that right." "The law isn't always right," Mrs. Abernathy replied softly. The first snow of winter came early that year. Thomas was in his study going over the ledgers when he heard an urgent pounding at the front door. He opened it to find Jimmy, one of his youngest ranch hands, his face red from riding hard through the cold. "Mr. Blackwood, sir. You better come quick. It's that Carter girl. She's hurt bad." Thomas didn't wait for details. He grabbed his coat and gloves, barking orders for Doc Wilson to follow, and rode toward the Carter place with Jimmy struggling to keep up. "Found her by the creek," Jimmy explained breathlessly as they rode. "I was checking the south fence line when I saw something blue in the snow. Thought it was a lost shirt at first, but then I saw it was her, sir. She wasn't moving, and she's got marks on her like someone—" The boy's voice broke. Thomas urged midnight faster, his heart pounding. When they reached the creek, he saw her immediately. A small form in a thin blue dress collapsed in the snow. Sarah's face was pale, her lips tinged blue from cold, and a dark bruise bloomed across her cheek. Thomas was off his horse in an instant, kneeling beside her. Her eyelids fluttered weakly. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered. Relief flooded through him. "You're going to be all right, Sarah. I'm taking you somewhere safe." She clutched at his coat with fingers red from cold. "Don't take me back, please. He said he'd kill me if I ran away again." Something fierce and protective roared to life in Thomas's chest. He wrapped her in his coat and lifted her gently, cradling her against him as he mounted Midnight. "You're never going back there, Sarah. I promise you that." As they rode toward the rocking bee, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her small body shivering violently against him. Thomas had never ridden so carefully yet so urgently in his life, aware of each precious minute passing. Mrs. Abernathy was waiting on the porch, alerted by one of the hands who'd ridden ahead. Her face paled when she saw Sarah, but she moved with efficient calm, directing Thomas to bring the girl upstairs to the room that had once been prepared for his own child. "Get those wet clothes off her," Mrs. Abernathy instructed as she stoked the fire. "I'll fetch warm blankets and heat some broth." Thomas hesitated, suddenly aware of the impropriety, but Mrs. Abernathy gave him a stern look. "There's no time for modesty, Mr. Blackwood. That child is half frozen." Working together, they got Sarah into a warm nightgown that had once belonged to Mrs. Abernathy's niece. By the time Doc Wilson arrived, they had her bundled in blankets before the fire, sipping weakly at broth. The doctor's examination confirmed what Thomas had feared. Beyond the cold and hunger, Sarah had been badly mistreated. Bruises in various stages of healing marked her thin body, and 2 ribs were cracked. "This didn't happen today," Doc Wilson said quietly, his kind face grim with anger. "Will she be all right?" Thomas asked, his voice rough. "With proper care, yes. But she can't go back to Carter. Not if you want her to survive the winter." Thomas's jaw set in a hard line. "She's not going back, ever." That night, as Sarah slept safely upstairs, Thomas sat in his study with a glass of whiskey, turning over his options. The law was clear. Frank Carter was Sarah's legal guardian. Taking her without permission could be considered kidnapping, regardless of the circumstances. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mrs. Abernathy, her normally composed face troubled. "She's asking for you, sir." "Had a nightmare." Thomas found Sarah sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. The bruise on her face looked even darker against her pale skin. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered. "He'll come for me." Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "No one's going to hurt you anymore, Sarah. I won't let that happen. But he's my guardian. That's what the law says." Thomas was struck by how much she understood about her situation, even at 11. "Sometimes the law needs a little help getting things right," he said gently. "Do you have any other family, Sarah? Anyone else who might take you in?" She shook her head. "Just Uncle Frank. Papa didn't have any other family left." "What about your mother's side?" Sarah's fingers twisted in the blankets. "Mama's family disowned her when she married Papa. They were rich, and he was just a teacher." She looked up at him with eyes too old for her years. "They didn't even come to her funeral." Thomas felt a familiar anger rising, the same he'd felt during the war when witnessing injustice he was powerless to stop. But this time he wasn't powerless. "Sarah," he said carefully, "what if you could stay here, at the Rocking Bee?" Hope flickered across her face before doubt extinguished it. "Uncle Frank wouldn't allow it. He said I'm valuable, because I can work without him having to pay wages." Thomas struggled to keep his expression neutral, though rage burned beneath his calm exterior. "What if I told you I have an idea? It might take a little time, but I believe I can make it so you never have to go back to your uncle's again." For the first time since he'd met her, Sarah's face brightened with a real smile. It transformed her completely, showing the child she should have been all along. "Really?" Thomas promised, tucking the blankets around her. "Now try to get some sleep. You're safe here." As he turned to leave, Sarah's small voice stopped him. "Mr. Blackwood, Penny says, you're the nicest man we've ever met." Thomas glanced at the worn rag doll propped against the pillow and felt something in his chest loosen, something that had been tight for 8 long years. "Tell Penny I'm honored by her good opinion." The next morning, Thomas rode into town before dawn. His first stop was the telegraph office, where he sent urgent messages to lawyers in Helena and back east. His second stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Matthews was a practical man who'd fought alongside Thomas in the war. He listened without interruption as Thomas explained the situation, his weathered face growing darker with each detail. "I want to do this legally," Thomas finished. "But one way or another, that girl is not going back to Carter." Matthews sighed heavily. "You know how it is, Thomas. The law gives guardianship to next of kin. Unless you can prove he's unfit, and I mean really prove it, not just suspicions, there's not much I can do officially. The girl has broken ribs and bruises all over her body," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "Carter will claim she's clumsy, or she fell. It'll be his word against hers." Matthews leaned forward. "I'm not saying it's right, just telling you how it is." Thomas stood, his decision made. "Then I'll handle it myself." "Thomas," Matthews called as he reached the door. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Just be careful. Carter's a mean drunk, and mean drunks are unpredictable." Frank Carter came roaring up to the Rocking Bee 3 days later, as Thomas had known he would. Mrs. Abernathy had taken Sarah upstairs at the first sight of dust on the road, with strict instructions to stay out of sight. Thomas met Carter on the porch, his rifle visible but not directly threatening. 2 of his most trusted hands stood casually nearby, making it clear this wasn't a conversation Carter would win through intimidation. "Where's my niece, Blackwood?" Carter demanded, his bloodshot eyes darting past Thomas toward the house. "I know you've got her. That's kidnapping, and I'll see you hang for it." "The girl was half dead when my hand found her," Thomas replied evenly. "Doc Wilson's statement says another day in that condition would have killed her." "Accidents happen," Carter sneered. "Clumsy little thing. always falling or running into things. Like your fist? Thomas took a step forward, his voice dropping dangerously. We both know what really happened, Carter. The question is, what happens now? Carter spat on the ground. What happens is, you give me back my property, or I come back with the law. She's a child, not property, Thomas said, his control slipping. And if you think Sheriff Matthews doesn't know exactly what kind of man you are, you're even dumber than you look. Carter's hand twitched toward his gun, but the click of rifles being cocked by Thomas's men froze him in place. Here's what's going to happen, Thomas continued calmly. I have a proposition for you, one that makes this problem go away and puts money in your pocket. Greed flickered in Carter's eyes, momentarily displacing his anger. Thomas withdrew an envelope from his coat. This is a bank draft for $500. It's yours, in exchange for signing these papers. He held up a document. They relinquish your guardianship of Sarah and transfer it to me legally and permanently. Carter's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Why would you want a useless girl like that? She ain't even kin to you. My reasons are my own, Thomas replied coldly. Do we have a deal? Carter hesitated, visibly calculating. Make it 1,000. 600. And I don't tell every man in the territory how you beat a defenseless child. Your reputation's bad enough already, Carter. Think you can afford for it to get worse? The threat hit its mark. Men could forgive many things on the frontier, but cruelty to children wasn't among them. Carter snatched the papers and scrawled his signature without reading them, then grabbed the bank draft Thomas offered. She was nothing but trouble anyway, he muttered. Hope you enjoy your new burden, Blackwood. Thomas watched him ride away with a mixture of disgust and relief. The papers might not hold up in every court, but they were a start. The telegrams he'd sent would do the rest, ensuring the arrangement was properly legalized. He turned to find Mrs. Abernathy standing in the doorway, her expression both approving and concerned. It's done, Thomas confirmed. Where's Sarah? Hiding under the bed, Mrs. Abernathy said with a slight smile. Poor thing was terrified he'd take her back. Thomas took the stairs 2 at a time. He knocked gently on the door of what was now Sarah's room. Sarah, it's Mr. Blackwood. Your uncle's gone, and he won't be coming back. There was a rustling sound, and then Sarah's face appeared, peering out from under the bed. Ever, Thomas confirmed, kneeling down to her level. He signed papers giving me guardianship over you. If you're agreeable, that is. Sarah crawled out, her expression cautiously hopeful. You mean I can stay here? At the Rocking Bee. This is your home now, Sarah. For as long as you want it to be. She launched herself at him with surprising strength, her thin arms wrapping around his neck. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Thomas hesitated only a moment before returning the embrace, something long dormant stirring in his heart. I think, since we're going to be family now, you might call me Thomas. Sarah pulled back, her face serious. Would it be all right if I called you something else? Not uncle, she added hastily. I don't like that word anymore. What would you like to call me? Thomas asked. Sarah looked down, suddenly shy. Maybe guardian? Because that's what you are. You're protecting me. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. Guardian it is, then. The first year at the Rocking Bee was one of adjustment for both Sarah and Thomas. For Sarah, it meant learning to trust that not all adults would hurt her, that there was enough food to eat, and that making mistakes wouldn't result in punishment. For Thomas, it meant rediscovering parts of himself he'd thought died with Catherine, patience, tenderness, even occasional laughter. While Mrs. Abernathy took charge of Sarah's education, supplemented by books Thomas ordered from back east. Sarah proved to be a quick study, devouring everything from history to mathematics with an enthusiasm that reminded Thomas of descriptions of her father. She's got a teacher's mind, Mrs. Abernathy observed one evening as they watched Sarah reading by the fire, absorbed in a volume about ancient Rome. That girl's going to want more than ranch life someday. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Then we'll make sure she has the means to pursue it. Spring brought new beginnings to the Rocking Bee. Thomas hired additional hands to expand the operation, and the ranch flourished under his renewed energy and purpose. Sarah blossomed too, her thin frame filling out, her complexion brightening with health. The bruises faded, though Thomas sometimes caught her rubbing her ribs when she thought no one was looking, a habit from when they'd been broken. One bright May morning, Thomas found Sarah sitting on the corral fence, watching intently as the wranglers broke a new string of horses. "Careful there," he cautioned, coming to stand beside her. "Those rails aren't as steady as they look." "Guardian," she said, without taking her eyes off the horses, "do you think I could learn to ride? A real horse, not just the old plow mare." Thomas studied her profile, noting the determination in her eyes. "I don't see why not. Every rancher needs to ride." Sarah turned to him, her face lighting up. "Really? You'll teach me?" "I'll do better than that," Thomas said, making a decision. "Wait here." He returned a few minutes later, leading a small sorrel mare with a white blaze down her face. The horse was young but gentle, with intelligent eyes that regarded Sarah curiously. "This is Copper," Thomas said. "She's yours, if you want her." Sarah slid down from the fence, approaching the mare with reverent steps. "Every good rancher needs their own horse," Thomas said simply. "You'll have to learn to care for her properly. Feeding, grooming, everything." "I will," Sarah promised solemnly, reaching out to stroke Copper's velvet nose. "I'll take the best care of her." Thomas watched the girl and the horse getting acquainted, a sense of rightness settling over him. This was what the Rocking Bee had been missing all these years. Not just a child, but this particular child with her courage and determination. Life fell into a comfortable pattern. Sarah learned to ride Copper with a natural grace that surprised even the most experienced wranglers. She helped with ranch chores, continued her studies, and slowly the shadows in her eyes began to fade. Thomas found himself looking forward to their evening ritual, sitting by the fire while Sarah read aloud from whatever book had captured her interest that week. But peace rarely lasts uninterrupted on the frontier. The trouble came in the form of Esther Holloway, a widow from Boston who arrived in town claiming to be Sarah's maternal aunt. News traveled fast in small communities, and stories of the wealthy rancher who'd taken in an orphan girl had apparently reached all the way to the East Coast. Sheriff Matthews rode out personally to deliver the news. "She's got papers," Thomas says. "She's been looking for the girl since her sister died. Claims she never knew about the child until recently." Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "What does she want?" Matthews looked uncomfortable. "Says she wants to take the girl back east, give her a proper upbringing among family." "Sarah has family," Thomas said sharply. "Here." "I know that," Matthews said patiently. "But the woman's got a lawyer with her. Fancy fellow from Helena. They're talking about blood rights superseding your guardianship papers, especially since," he hesitated. "Since what?" "Since they were signed by a man who died 3 months ago." Thomas stared at him. "Carter's dead." Matthews nodded grimly. "Drank himself to death finally. Found him frozen outside the saloon in February." Thomas absorbed this information silently. He'd heard rumors of Carter's worsening condition, but had deliberately avoided thinking about the man. "Does Sarah know? About this aunt?" "Not yet," Matthews said. "Thought you should be the one to tell her." That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone in his study, turning over options in his mind. The law would likely favor a blood relative over an unrelated guardian, especially a single man. Esther Holloway had wealth, social position, and the advantage of being a woman, all things a judge would consider beneficial for raising a young girl. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway in her nightgown, her face troubled. "You're worried about something," she said. It wasn't a question. Mrs. Abernathy was acting strange at dinner, and you barely said 2 words. Thomas sighed. He should have known she would notice. Come sit down, Sarah. There's something we need to discuss. She listened quietly as he explained about her aunt, her face growing more closed with each word. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. Do I have to go with her? She finally asked, her voice small. I don't know, Thomas answered honestly. Legally, she may have a stronger claim than I do. But I don't know her. I don't even remember my mother talking about a sister. Thomas leaned forward. Sarah, I promise you this. I will fight to keep you here if that's what you want. But I need to know. Is it what you want? Your aunt can offer you things I can't. Education, society, advantages that don't exist out here. Sarah's chin lifted in that determined way he'd come to know so well. The rocking bee is my home. You're my family. I don't want to go back east. Relief flooded through Thomas, followed immediately by resolve. Then we'll fight this together. The meeting was arranged at the town hotel 2 days later. Thomas brought Sarah, dressed in her Sunday best, along with Mrs. Abernathy for propriety's sake. Sheriff Matthews was also present, along with Judge Wilson, who had ridden in from the county seat. Esther Holloway was a handsome woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed in traveling clothes that would have been fashionable in Boston, but looked out of place in a frontier town. Her lawyer, Mr. Harrington, had the polished look of someone who'd never worked with his hands. My dear Sarah, Mrs. Holloway exclaimed, moving forward with outstretched arms. At last we meet. You look so much like your mother. Sarah stepped back, pressing closer to Thomas. Mrs. Holloway's smile tightened slightly. Of course you don't remember me. You were very young when your mother and I had our disagreement. But blood is blood, and now that I've found you, I intend to give you the life your mother would have wanted for you. My mother wanted me with my father, Sarah said quietly, and now I'm with my guardian. I'm staying at the Rocking Bee. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this reasonably. Miss Carter is understandably attached to Mr. Blackwood after her ordeal, but surely everyone agrees that a young lady's proper place is with her family in civilization. The Rocking Bee is civilization, Sarah retorted. We have books and music and proper manners, and it's Morrison now, not Carter. Sarah Morrison. Thomas felt a surge of pride and surprise at her use of his surname. They had never formally discussed it, but apparently Sarah had made her choice clear. Mrs. Holloway's facade of pleasantness slipped. This is absurd. She belongs with me. I'm her mother's sister. The sister who didn't attend her funeral, Sarah asked pointedly. The one who turned her back when my mother needed her most. Mrs. Holloway flushed. You don't understand adult matters, child. I understand more than you think, Sarah replied. I understand that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who take care of you when everyone else has left. Judge Wilson, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Mrs. Holloway, while your claim has legal merit, we must consider the child's wishes as well. Sarah seems quite settled here. Her wishes? Mrs. Holloway scoffed. She's 11 years old. Nearly 12, Sarah corrected, and old enough to know where I belong. Thomas placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. Judge, I've formally petitioned to adopt Sarah. The paperwork was filed last month. We were waiting for approval when Mrs. Holloway arrived. This was news to everyone in the room, including Sarah, who looked up at him with startled joy. Adoption, Mrs. Holloway's voice rose. You can't possibly think an unmarried man should be allowed to adopt a young girl. It's completely inappropriate. Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward, her quiet dignity commanding attention. If I may, Judge, I've lived at the Rocking Bee for 15 years. In that time, I've never met a more honorable man than Thomas Blackwood. That child has flourished under his care in ways you can't imagine, considering what she survived before. Judge Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "And what exactly is your interest in the child, Mrs. Holloway? You've never sought her out before now." Mrs. Holloway shifted uncomfortably. "As I said, I only recently learned of her whereabouts, and I feel a responsibility to my sister's memory." "Is that the only reason?" the judge pressed. Mr. Harrington attempted to intervene. "My client's motives are not on trial here, Your Honor." "Perhaps they should be," Thomas said quietly. "My sources in Boston tell me Mrs. Holloway's late husband left his estate in trust for any heirs of his bloodline. With no children of her own, she has limited access to that fortune unless she can prove guardianship of a relative." Mrs. Holloway's face contorted with anger. "How dare you imply—" "Is it true?" Judge Wilson interrupted. The silence that followed was answer enough. The judge sighed heavily. "This is a complicated situation that deserves more consideration than we can give it today." He turned to Sarah. "Young lady, where would you prefer to stay while this matter is resolved?" "With my guardian," Sarah said without hesitation. "At the rocking bee." Judge Wilson nodded. "Then that's where you'll remain for now. Mrs. Holloway, I'll review your petition and Mr. Blackwood's adoption application. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks' time." As they rode back to the ranch, Sarah was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, as the rocking bee came into view, she asked, "Did you mean it? About adopting me?" Thomas glanced down at her. "I did. I should have discussed it with you first, but it seemed like the right thing to do. So I would really be Sarah Morrison, legally." "If that's what you want," Thomas said carefully, "you don't have to take my name. You could keep Carter or even take Holloway if you prefer." Sarah made a face. "I don't want either of those names. Carter reminds me of Uncle Frank, and Holloway belongs to someone who didn't want my mother." She straightened in her saddle. "I want to be a Morrison. I want to belong to the rocking bee, for real." Something warm spread through Thomas's chest. "Then that's what we'll fight for." The 2 weeks that followed were tense. Mrs. Holloway remained in town, making her presence felt through frequent visits to the judge and thinly veiled threats delivered via her lawyer. Thomas responded by gathering character references from everyone of importance in the territory, the banker, the minister, even the governor whom he'd once helped during a harsh winter. Sarah threw herself into ranch work with unusual intensity, as if trying to prove her place there. Thomas often found her long after bedtime, still reading by candlelight or writing in the journal he'd given her. "You need your rest," he admonished gently one night, taking the book from her hands. "I'm memorizing everything," Sarah explained. "About the ranch, about you and Mrs. Abernathy, about copper." "In case what?" "In case they make me leave," Sarah whispered. "I don't want to forget anything about home." Thomas sat on the edge of her bed, his heart heavy. "Sarah, listen to me. Whatever happens at that hearing, this will always be your home, and we will always be family, no matter where you are." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But what if she wins? What if I have to go to Boston?" "Then you'll go with your head held high, knowing you're a Morrison in your heart. You'll get the best education money can buy, and when you're old enough, you'll come back if that's what you want. The rocking bee will be waiting for you." Sarah threw her arms around his neck. "I don't want to be brave, I just want to stay." Thomas held her close, making a silent vow that he would move heaven and earth to keep this promise. The day of the hearing dawned clear and cold. Thomas wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to Catherine's funeral and hadn't touched since. Sarah wore a blue dress Mrs. Abernathy had made specially, with a ribbon in her hair that matched her eyes. The town was buzzing with gossip. Everyone had an opinion about whether the wealthy Eastern widow or the respected local rancher should raise Sarah. Most sided with Thomas, but there were those who felt a girl needed a woman's guidance in a proper household. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. Mrs. Holloway sat at one table with her lawyer, looking confident in an expensive traveling suit. Thomas and Sarah took their place at the opposite table, joined by the young lawyer Thomas had hired from Helena. Judge Wilson called the room to order. "This is an unusual case," he began. "We have two parties seeking guardianship of a child, both with valid claims. Mrs. Holloway has the claim of blood relation. Mr. Blackwood has the claim of established guardianship and a petition for adoption. The law provides guidance in these matters, but it cannot account for every circumstance." Mrs. Holloway's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, while Mr. Blackwood's intentions may be admirable, the fact remains that a single man cannot provide the feminine influence a young girl requires. Holloway can offer Sarah education, culture, and entry into proper society, all things her mother would have wanted for her." Thomas's lawyer countered, "Your Honor, Mr. Blackwood has created a stable, loving home for Sarah. She has thrived under his care after suffering grievous abuse from her previous guardian. To uproot her now would cause significant trauma. Furthermore, Mrs. Abernathy provides the feminine influence the opposition claims is lacking." The arguments continued back and forth, becoming increasingly technical. Sarah sat quietly beside Thomas, her small hand gripping his tightly under the table. Finally, Judge Wilson raised his hand. "I've heard enough legal arguments. Now I'd like to hear from Sarah herself." He beckoned her forward. "Young lady, please tell me in your own words where you wish to live and why." Sarah approached the bench, her steps steady despite her obvious nervousness. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her clear voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, before I came to the Rocking Bee, I didn't know what it meant to have a real home. My father loved me. But after he died, I learned that not all family treats you with kindness." She glanced briefly at Thomas. "My guardian taught me that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose you, who protect you when no one else will." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her worn rag doll. "This is Penny. She's been with me through everything. When I was scared or hurt or alone, I would tell Penny that someday we'd find a place where we belonged. At the Rocking Bee, we found that place." Sarah turned to face Mrs. Holloway directly. "I'm sorry if this hurts you, ma'am. I believe you might want what's best for me in your own way. But you don't know me. You don't know that I love riding at dawn when the mountains are still purple, or that I want to learn Latin because my father knew it, or that sometimes I still have nightmares about Uncle Frank." She turned back to the judge. "My guardian knows these things. He's never tried to make me into someone I'm not. He just helps me become who I'm meant to be. That's what family does." She lifted her chin. "I want to stay at the Rocking Bee. I want to be Sarah Morrison." A profound silence fell over the courtroom. Even Mrs. Holloway seemed moved, a flicker of something like regret crossing her face. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "Thank you, Sarah. You may return to your seat." The judge considered for several long moments before speaking. The law generally favors blood relations in matters of guardianship. However, the law also recognizes that the welfare of the child must be the primary consideration. He looked directly at Mrs. Holloway. "Madam, your claim has legal merit, but I find your motivations questionable and your previous absence from the child's life troubling." Turning to Thomas, he continued, "Mr. Blackwood, your petition for adoption shows a genuine commitment to this child's well-being. The community testimonials speak to your character and capability as a guardian." Judge Wilson straightened in his chair. "It is the finding of this court that Sarah's best interests are served by remaining in the stable environment Mr. Blackwood has provided. The petition for adoption is granted, pending the usual probationary period. Sarah Carter shall henceforth be legally recognized as Sarah Morrison, with all the rights and privileges thereto." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Sarah threw her arms around Thomas, who lifted her in a rare public display of emotion. Mrs. Abernathy wiped tears from her eyes, and even the sheriff looked suspiciously misty. Mrs. Holloway rose stiffly, gathering her belongings. As she passed their table, she paused. "She does look like Elizabeth," she said quietly to Sarah. "My sister, you have her eyes." Sarah hesitated, then reached out to touch Mrs. Holloway's hand. "Thank you for telling me that. I don't remember much about her." Something softened in Mrs. Holloway's expression. Perhaps someday, when you're older, you might want to know more about your mother's family. If so, you could write to me." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I might do that, ma'am." With a last nod to Thomas, Mrs. Holloway departed, her lawyer trailing behind. Outside the courthouse, the townspeople gathered to congratulate them. Thomas was surprised to find himself accepting handshakes and backslaps with good grace. Sarah stayed close by his side, beaming with happiness. "Let's go home, Papa," she said, using the word for the first time. Thomas looked down at her in surprise, a lump forming in his throat. "Yes," he managed. "Let's go home, daughter." The years passed swiftly at the rocking bee. Sarah grew from a thin, cautious child into a confident young woman with her father's intelligence and a courage all her own. Thomas expanded the ranch, built a proper school for the children of his workers and neighboring homesteaders, and slowly allowed himself to participate more fully in the life of the community. They faced challenges together: drought years, harsh winters, cattle thieves, and the changing face of the frontier as the railroad pushed ever westward. Through it all, the bond between them only strengthened. On Sarah's 18th birthday, Thomas presented her with a leather-bound journal. "I've been keeping this since the day you came to the rocking bee," he explained as she turned the pages in wonder. "I wanted you to have a record of your life here, of how far you've come." Sarah read entries describing her first successful ride on Copper, her triumph at the county fair when she was 14, the night she'd stayed up with a sick calf and saved its life. Thomas had faithfully recorded it all, his pride evident in every word. "There's something else," Thomas said, handing her an envelope. "This came from back east last week." Sarah opened it to find an acceptance letter from a prestigious women's college in Massachusetts, along with confirmation that her tuition had been paid in full. "How?" she gasped. "We never applied." "I did," Thomas admitted. "After your teacher said you were the brightest student she'd ever taught. You've always loved learning, Sarah. I didn't want to hold you back just because I'd miss you." Sarah stared at the letter, conflicting emotions crossing her face. "But the ranch, I always thought—" "The rocking bee will always be here," Thomas assured her. "This is your home, no matter where life takes you. But you deserve the chance to see more of the world than just Montana territory." "What if I don't want to go?" Thomas smiled gently. "Then that's your choice, but I want you to have options your mother and father never had." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Penny, who still held a place of honor on her bed despite her worn appearance. "I could study teaching," she said finally, "like my father, and then come back and teach at our school properly, with real knowledge, not just what we can piece together from books." Thomas nodded. "You could do that. You could do anything, Sarah. That's what I've tried to give you, not just a home but the freedom to choose your own path." Sarah looked around her room, at the books lining the shelves, the riding boots by the door, the view of the mountains from her window. Then she looked at the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "You know what my father used to say?" she asked softly. "He said that the greatest gift we can give another person is to believe in them before they believe in themselves." She held up the journal. "That's what you did for me. You believed I could be more than just a scared little girl abandoned on the road." Thomas swallowed hard. "You made it easy. You were always brave even when you had every reason not to be." Sarah hugged him fiercely. "I'll go to college," she decided. "I'll learn everything I can, and then I'll come back. Because this is where I belong. This is where I first learned what it means to have a home." On the porch that evening, Thomas watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Sarah sat beside him, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder as they shared a comfortable silence. "Papa," she said, eventually, "do you ever think about that day, when you found me by the creek?" Thomas nodded. "More often than you might imagine. Do you believe in fate? That things happen for a reason?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I believe that good can come from even the darkest circumstances, if we're brave enough to look for it." Sarah smiled. "That's what I think, too. If Uncle Frank hadn't been so cruel, if I hadn't run away that day, if you hadn't been checking that fence line," she squeezed his hand. "So many little chances that led to us becoming a family. Some things are just meant to be," Thomas said simply. "Like you becoming a Morrison." As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, they sat together in the peaceful knowledge that whatever changes the future might bring, the bond between them was unbreakable. Sarah had found her place to belong, and Thomas had found the family he thought he'd never have. The rocking bed wasn't just a ranch anymore. It was a home, built not of timber and nails, but of courage, choice, and love. The strongest foundations of all.